Well, here we are back at the workbench, and if it looks like we've taken a step back, it's because we have. After I pre-assembled the columns and roof trusses with the crane rails, it became very clear that it wasn't going to be strong enough to hold its own with just the connections between the rails and the columns. And in fact, the best way to hold everything together was to use the walls themselves between the columns. And so I took apart the pre-assembled structure that you saw in the last video and sanded down the ends or the sides of the columns. And then while I was at it, I sanded down the tops of the roof beams because that's where we're going to glue on the roof members. At the same time, I put together the roof and column pieces and sanded them as well, top and sides. These are the pieces that will make up the pallet storage area on one side of the building. These are the products that I'll be using for the walls. As I mentioned in an earlier video, it's actually designed as a roofing material, but it quite nicely matches the prototype in terms of the ribbing on the side of the siding. So each one of these packages comes with two pieces. That's 2 inches by about 11 inches or 15 feet by 80 feet in HO scale. I've got 5 packages so far. I got another half a dozen or so that are back ordered, but this should be enough to demonstrate how the walls will be assembled and connected to the columns. Each package, as we mentioned before, contains 2 of these sheets. Because it's designed as a roofing system, each package also comes with 2 of these templates. These templates are designed to be used with these ridges that are built into the backside of the sheets to hold the roof at a certain angle. Coincidentally, the Pike Stuff kit uses the same 12:1 angle that we're using on our template, and I double checked that by using an actual piece from a Pike Stuff kit, and you can see they've got the very same angle, 12:1. So at a later state of our project, we will be able to use these to hold our roof pieces steady as we set them up for gluing onto our roof trusses. Now also, because these are designed as roof pieces, there's 2 different edges. There's a smooth edge here. You can feel it by running your finger along it. And the other edge, when you run your finger along it, you feel the ridges. And that's because it's designed to be assembled at an angle like that. So they're actually cut at slightly different angles so that when you assemble them, they butt together and there's no crack in the roof when the pieces go together. Now, since we're using these as wall pieces, we have to make sure that they lie flat, so we have to run a file and slightly sand off the one edge to make sure it's square, so everything butts together as a vertical piece along the wall. And we also have to remove some sections of these ridges so that when we try to connect it to our columns, they're not in the way in trying to glue it together. So a lot of work ahead of us. Let's see how it goes. Okay, before we get started on the wall assembly, I'd like to first point out that one of the most important tools that you'll need for building any wall is a square ruler, in this case a metal square ruler. That's what I'm using. It's also important to have a sharp X-Acto blade, a metal flat file, and a medium grade sandpaper. In this case, this is 120 grit. Now, the first thing I noticed about the Pike Stuff roofing panels was that they have a slight warp in them. It does not affect their intended use as single panel roof sheets, but if you want to use them to build walls more than 15 scale feet high, they have to butt up against each other along a straight seam. As you can see, depending on how you orient them, they will either meet in the middle with openings at the end, and then if you turn them around, they will meet at the ends and have a gap in the middle. You could flip one way, and they kind of butt up well, the seam, but if you look closely, you'll find that the corrugations, well, they might start matching up. When you get to the other end, they're slightly off. So you could do that, I suppose, if you're not concerned about that fine level detail, but that kind of goes against the level of prototype fidelity we're trying to achieve here. So the solution is to slowly sand these by running them back and forth along sandpaper very slowly, very carefully, and measuring them against the square ruler as you go, to make sure that you're slowly bringing the edges into a flat orientation. And you'll also want to make sure that as you're sanding, and that once you're done, that you make sure you get rid of any fine little stray bits of styrene that are hanging on, because when you do butt it together with the glue, you're going to end up, you'll want to make sure that there's no fine bits there that with the glue become noticeable or obvious. You want to have as clean a seam as possible. The second thing I noticed about the Pike Stuff panels was there are two slightly different but distinct corrugation spacings. Even after sanding the edges square, the corrugations don't line up. So here you can see on the bottom they're lined up, but when you get to the other end, they're ever so slightly off. The coloration seems to be different as well. I don't know if they've changed the content or the chemical makeup of the plastic, or maybe how thin it is. But this one on the right you see here, it's got a grayish hue to it, and this one is pure white. It's not really an issue so long as I have enough of the right corrugation spacings to put one on top of the other vertically, so the corrugations line up. I haven't opened up all the other package yet. Hopefully I'll have enough to make it fit. The difference is, is not terribly noticeable, but again, in keeping with the prototype fidelity, so long as I can use like with like, one on top of the other, I'll be sure that all the ribs will match up throughout the project. Now, one last thing about the raw materials before we get to the assembly. In order to build a building longer than 80 scale feet in length, these panels obviously need to butt up against each other. The seams obviously have to be square, but the corrugation pattern has to be maintained. Otherwise it won't look like the prototype. So here you see that if we just sanded them lightly and butted them up one against each other, you'd get a different corrugation pattern at the ends. So the ends have to be carefully, slowly trimmed back so that you get an exact match carrying across the seam. The wall is put together one panel at a time, using the ruler to keep everything square. This wall is a little over 25 inches long and about 6 inches high, so it needed 3 rows, each with 2 1/3 panels. It's a slow process because each panel that is added must be checked to make sure that the corrugations line up. This is critical because once you have laid out all the pieces, you have to turn them over to glue them together, and you'll have to trust that the corrugations will line up. Here's a close-up view showing all the panels tucked tightly into the corner of the steel square ruler, and if we look carefully we can see all of the ridges line up right across all three panels, and as well from one panel to the next on the horizontal rows. These have all been trimmed back, sanded sharp and smooth, and the corrugation spacing checked by overlaying one to the next row. And closely here, even though there's a seam between these two corrugations, it matches the corrugation spacing. The gluing is done in two steps with a few other activities in between. First, I cut 2 strips of O2O styrene. This is used to glue the 3 panels in each row together. This will significantly reduce the number of parts sliding around on the workbench. And then I marked out where each of the columns would go. These are spaced 3 and 7/16 of an inch apart. You see there's an example of where one of them would go. And then followed that up with removing the ridges that you find on the back of these panels, because they're in the way of the connector strips of styrene, and that'll be used to hold the 3 rows together, as well as being in the way of the columns that are glued to the walls. This created some interesting works of scrapyard art, depending on how fast you move the X-Acto blade. Tight curls, moving very fast. Longer curls from when I took my time. Just an interesting byproduct of the process. Now I left as much as possible of these ridges in place on the top and bottom of the walls. On the bottom, I just felt that it would be good to keep something here that would maintain the rigidity of the wall as much as possible. There wasn't a need to remove it. On top, it's just a bonus that this ridge acts as a landing place, if you will, for the future roofing panels, for them to rest on that and be glued to if indeed we don't want to make it a removable roof. So that's just a happy coincidence. It works out well, and the space between the edge of the top of the wall and the ridge is about the thickness of the roof panels that we've purchased for this project. Now you may have noticed that I've not yet connected the top row of panels to the other 3, and that's because I'm going to be decorating my building in a similar fashion as the prototype. And anytime you're going to paint something more than one color, it is always better to paint the parts separately before assembly than trying to use masking tape, especially if the surface is not flat. In our case, the ridges on the outside would make it impossible to get a clean dividing line between the colors if we were to try and do it with masking tape. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the old saying, measure twice, cut once. For some reason that I can't explain, even though my drawings show a building height of 6 and 3/16 of an inch, I set the height of the columns on my paper template at 6 and 1/8 inch. The pike stuff panels each measure 2 and 1/16 of an inch high each, and 3 of them create a perfect match for the prototype of 6 and 3/16 of an inch high. So even now, after all the sanding that I've done to square up the panels, my walls are about 3/32 of an inch taller than my columns, and you can see that here right at the end of the column, where it's just shy of the edge of the wall. So now I have to decide whether to trim the bottom panels or shim the columns. I don't really want to trim the top panels because I like the idea of having the ridge for the roof panels to sit on. I don't really want to trim the bottom panels because then the panel seams will not be evenly spaced. So I'm going with column shims that I'll make from small strips of styrene. And if anyone asks, I'll just call them raised concrete footings. A couple of pointers about this glue that we're using. Despite what I said earlier in the video, it is not an instant glue, so you do have a few seconds at least to move the pieces around when you're installing your vertical connectors to make sure that the corrugations line up perfectly. The second thing is that it's a very thin glue, so it will move through capillary action between all the seams. So you want to have the glue on either side of the seam, but not so much in the middle, because when you push pieces together, it will tend to ooze between the crack, and you'll need to clean it up later. Now, to limit the impact the glue has on the seam, you'll want to clean up any stray bits of styrene from your sanding and cuts by going very slowly, one rib at a time along the seam line to clean up. Now this is, use a dull blade. You don't want to use a very sharp blade, or if you're using a sharp blade, you don't want to press very hard because you don't want to actually scratch or cut through the styrene. And you can use a toothbrush as you're going along to see how well you're doing. But it's literally one corrugation at a time, and just cleaning up all the stray bits and pieces so that when you actually glue it together, you get a nice clean seam, and hopefully the glue doesn't ooze through too much. And again, you'd repeat this afterwards before the glue is completely dry, just to make sure you've cleaned up all the stray bits and pieces. Here's a sneak peek at what a finished wall section would look like. Different from what we saw in the prototype photos. I'm using a little bit of Quebec and New England colors to tie it into the railroad theme. For that, I found it's called Apple Red Rust-Oleum, and if you put it on a little too thick, it gets quite glossy, so you have to go in a couple of even light coats. And you can see there's a couple of areas here that I might need a second light coat, so I'll do that. The white, I happen to have some Krylon white left over from earlier jobs, so that's what I used for the bottom section. You can still see the seam line faintly there. I'm not going to worry too much about that. Eventually we'll put some weathering on and it'll look like a prototypical seam. It's not unreasonable to expect that there would be seam lines, so I think overall it's going to look quite nice. Now, just because we've started building our project doesn't mean we stop doing research. Here's the Steelway Building Systems website, and I thought it would be interesting to go back and take a second look at the Storm Seal product that we're using, just to see if there is any other information we might find useful to us as we move forward. On this particular website, if you click on multi-span under their products tab, multi-span, they provide a number of pictures of both finished products and products under construction. I thought this one was an interesting picture because it shows something very similar to what we're building. You can see that they've got openings here for truck drive-throughs, the third one here, and for us this could be our rail doors and this could be the truck door. But I wanted to show a couple of things here. One is that the inside walls are generally white or unpainted. This could be insulated and uninsulated, but for our purposes, we're going to leave the back of the walls white. That's the styrene that's going to be exposed, and it'll look completely prototypical if we want to have a removable roof section to look inside. The second thing to note is this building here also has crane rails that are painted yellow, just like we're planning to do with ours. Now, they didn't go with different column sizes as we have on our prototype drawings. You can see they used little outriggers, if you will, attached to the column that the crane rails sit on. So that's just another way of doing it, and if one was to scratch build a building like this, this is perhaps an easier way to do it, because you would have a single column all the way through and just extra pieces on the side to rest onto the to rest the crane rail onto. And again, some under construction drawings that give you a sense of possibilities. Now you see here, this one has concrete footing, so I think I'm okay with the shims that I'm going to have to put underneath my columns to make them match the height of the wall panels. So that was a nice thing to see. And let's see, there's a nice clean inside shot. Again, similar to what we're doing. This one doesn't have concrete footings, but all the same, it gives you a real good sense of what the interior looks like. So if you were so inclined to scratch build without plans, this is a really good template to use. Again, you can see a big heavy-duty crane sitting on top of, in this case, gray rails, but you get the idea. Now, as I mentioned before, we're not going to add the minor bracing between the main roof spans or between the main columns that normally is used to attach the wall panels, because it's a lot of extra work and expense, frankly, that probably isn't required, even if you're looking at the interior of an HO model. Of course, that's what the prototype does, to make sure that the walls remain stable and take wind loads, etc. Something we don't have to worry about in HO scale.